shed some light on the challenges facing those involved in technical production this afternoon, answer at least some of your questions. It's only a short session, so there isn't time to delve really deeply into any particular topic, more an overview of the process that we've experienced in the last few months. Very lucky to be joined today by an esteemed panel. Dominique Paisian-Faber, who's the Health and Safety Manager at the Royal Opera House. They've opened their first live show since March last Friday. Dominique is also chair of the IOS Theatre Advisory Group. Ben Stephen, who is Head of Operations and Production at the Albany. They've been constantly evolving their venues and programmes throughout the restrictions. Ben is also a member of the Production Managers Forum and represents the Independent Theatre Council on the Theatre Safety Committee. Carl Raw, Her Majesty's Inspector of Health and Safety with the Health and Safety Executive. Carl's remit includes entertainment and leisure. He facilitates engagement with the regulator for our industry, so it's great to have him here today. I'm Tom Good. I share my time between production management and consultancy in various different sectors of the industry, as well as being a technical consultant for Plaza. I'm also a Chartered Safety and Health practitioner, and I sit on various committees. Just before we make a start, I want to just cover a bit of context, really, in terms of what we're covering today. Obviously, we're delivering this seminar against a backdrop of huge uncertainty and challenges, with restrictions in place on closely seated audience and other activities that we're used to undertaking. And obviously that leads to a catastrophic situation across our industry. So many of the people in our community do what they do as a vocation rather than just a job, with huge personal investment made in developing their skills to become the truly extraordinary and world-class players that they're considered to be. We're very good at changing because we're by nature problem solvers. Obviously, from time to time, everybody in this industry takes a rest. At the moment, the resting we're doing is entirely beyond our control and determined by others. And it's not an option for many of these people to choose another career. It just doesn't work like that. So in terms of the context of this, I'm mindful that while we're talking about our recent experiences, many people have been unable to work for over 6 months with nothing on the horizon due to the current uncertainty, and just want to acknowledge how grim that situation is for many people. We should remember that not only are we viable, but we're actually crucial to a healthy society. So I think it's important that we acknowledge that up front. But on that note, without further ado, I shall hand over to Dominique, who will be able to tell us all about what's been going on in Covent Garden.
Hello, it's really a pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me. So I want to talk to you about what happened last Friday. So it was our big opening. We had 77 dancers on stage, 45 musicians in the stalls playing. And to help them to achieve that, we had a large teams working for nearly a month. And on the night, we had 20 staff for broadcasting. It was a live broadcast with 14,000 live stream. And then we had 15 ushers and technical staff, roughly 20 people backstage. So how did we manage that in COVID time, and what did it take us to achieve that? To say that the evening went very, very well. I'd like to share with you some picture because the first thing we had to really rethink is the way we use space. So the first picture you can see, it's actually our side stage, and this is what it usually looks like before a show. That was taken just a few minutes. Usually dancers, so the dancers ready to go on stage, technicians will be in that space. You will see some bars and so on where people warm up. And at the end of that, on that line, there's actually the prompt corners where people will get on stage. That's a few minutes before the show. If you can go to the next picture. That's what it actually looks like now. So beyond that pink curtain is actually the stage, is the area where I was just showing you before. And for 77 dancers, we have put chairs 2 meters apart. You can see there's some arrows on the floor, and that's the way they will now access the stage and go out to the stage, because they can't huddle together by that stage while waiting to get on stage. If you want to see the next picture, So that's our quick change area. Usually our quick change area were really small tents, much smaller than that. And they were roughly the same area where I was taking the pictures, the first picture, nowhere we could put them there. And so we created these two larger tents with one-way system where they can go for quick change. Again, that side stage. And that space was usually used for storage of sets. You can see the set at the back is Traviata. That has been in our building since March, because when we closed down, we were showing Traviata, and we still haven't removed that set from the building. So we were quite lucky to have that space to be able to expand our side stage, to be able to manage the number of dancers we had. And the next picture is to show you the orchestra. Yes, so our orchestra is usually in a pit. We have a large orchestra. We can have up to 98 people in our orchestra. That's a 45 orchestra players, but we have to remove all the seats in the stalls to give them that 2 meters away. So we lose a lot of seats because we can't fit them in the pit. We're going back to the pit soon, actually on Friday. So we have put back the seats, but we have to massively reduce our orchestra operations to be able to keep that 2 meters away in the pit. And we're putting orchestra on stage, which is okay for opera, because opera, there's not that many people on stage, so we have the space, but it was impossible for ballet when you've got so many ballet dancers. There were absolutely no space for an orchestra and ballet dancers on stage. So thinking of space has been a challenge, of course, on the night, but it's been a challenge throughout the preparation of that night. For example, the fittings, when you have to fit 77 dancers, we have fitting rooms in our costume area. Nowhere we could fit them, do the fittings in that space. Again, far too small. So we had to empty our rehearsal rooms and set up a new fitting space. And thinking of a space has been all the way through for every team. Even we had to think about how the dancers will pick up the flowers at the end of the show. Our dancers have got big teams of followers and fans that usually drop flowers at stage door. And the dancers will pick up the flowers at stage doors. But we're talking 30, 40 bunches of flowers. So the stage doors was like a flower boutique at the end of the show. Again, we could not deal with that in COVID time. So we had to create a space where the flowers will be dropped still at stage door. Security will be outside picking up the flowers, and put them in a space where dancers can pick up the flowers and still keeping safe distance. So space has been a major factor in planning for that show, before the show, during the show. In the same time as space, we had to think of simplification, major simplification of the set. If some people have seen the show, it was online. It was super simple, nothing like what we do usually for ballet. There was nearly no flying, no sets, no change, no quick change on the set. We got rid of all of that. Backstage, usually we have 44 in average, and 44 people, technicians backstage for any show. That's lighting, follow spots, stage hands, stage management. Last Friday, we managed with 20 because we simplified the show so much that we didn't have many people. And so simplification allows us to avoid like group lifting, for example, anything that needs to be done in group that we just don't use it. For ballet, for example, we had no props. We had one prop that well tried was a cane, but there was no props. A show like a dance like Don Quixote will have many props. Then we got off all the props, so we don't need then props, stage hands, because we got rid of them, rid of the props. So simplification also has been a major part of the way we dealt with the show. One of the biggest challenge I would say has been all the close contact work. So it's costume workers mainly, and of course dancers. To start with the dancers, we have paired or put in bubbles, couples, and they get tested. But they actually did rehearse with full mask on and rehearse as much as they can apart. and they only rehearse when they do the testing on the daily day. On the day they do the testing, they rehearse together, because on stage, of course, they were not wearing the mask, but the rehearsals were with full mask on. And for the costume workers, so a corset in ballet, you need some help. You need someone that help them to get in the corset. They can't close the corset by themselves. Again, that's close contact work and it's sustained contact, makeup, hair. And that has been the most challenging for our teams, our costume team, because it's a really brand new way of working. It's difficult to work with a full mask, with a visor, and to keep that distance. Even like our makeup room, usually we have a makeup room where we get 4 makeup at the same time. We had to reduce to 1. And that also changed the routines of dancers, which can be very challenging in getting in that mindset about getting on stage. So that has been the challenge for us, has been very close contact work, measure simplification, and finding that space. To come back on finding the space, the lucky bit we had is to have that space. We only have that space because we're not as busy as we used to. If we were running with the same schedule as we used to, we'll never have that space. And because if we don't run that much, that we can actually find that space. And we're lucky to have a very large building, but I can imagine small theatres. That would be a major challenge to be able to operate with 2 meters away without that space. We evaluate that we needed roughly 3 times the same space, 3 times what we usually need, at least 3 times, I would say. And so that from changing rooms to dressing rooms to makeup rooms to side stage to performance space, all of that we had to expand at least 3 times what we usually require. That's for me. I will be happy to take your question after.
Thank you very much, Dominique. That's been very interesting. Lovely. It'll be really good to see what common threads come out, I think, between what you've experienced and what Ben and myself can bring to it as well. So Ben, I'll hand over to you now, and you can tell us how everything's been in East London.
Yeah, South East London, so the opposite end of the scale. Apologies for also being in London, but I can't help that. So the Albany, for those who don't know, is a small art centre in South East London in Deptford. And I've got quite a few slides, so apologies that I'll keep saying next slide, please. So we'll crack into a slide. And we started with full houses like this, with seated audiences for theatre, spoken word, poetry, everything you can think of. We also do quite a lot of music. So if we can skip over onto the next slide, and the next slide again, where we've got everybody rammed in and everyone was having a great time. And then COVID happened, which is the next slide. And we all had to think about how to put up one of these posters in our foyers or otherwise. So we closed for a fairly brief period, but we kept going as best we could. And we did this outdoors in a tiny fashion to start with. So the next slide, which started very, very small with 6 bubbles in our garden. And then it grew a bit to 15 bubbles in the next slide with a caravan stage show outside. And we were doing this in parallel to reopening the building to our essential staff and tenanted offices once we were able to do that legally. What that meant was using the whole building as a one-way system, a bit like Dominique was saying. So the next slide is a quick view of that. And we had to do things like create a new temporary receptions in our foyer, which is the next slide. I don't believe in buying anything just because, so that's a couple of drum screens strapped to some steel deck. We're proper theatre in that sense. And we started redesigning everything to restart indoor performances in September. So we redesigned the one-way system inside the building. So another slide of that briefly. And we prepared to welcome audiences of 55, which is 11% of our capacity. So the next slide for that, and that was for a string of 33 shows with Goldsmiths University. So if we go on to the next one, this is a festival where we normally do every year, and we present 7 to 12 nights of live music with 4 bands a night. and we couldn't do that. That didn't work. So we split it into 33 shows over 6 days. And we segregated the audience from everybody else in an obvious fashion, but we also did this out the front of the building. So if we skip over to the next slide and we keep going, and we protected our staff where 2 metre isn't realistic. So temporary reception disappeared and got built back around our normal reception. We were screening for temperatures, which is a topic we might come on to. So there's another slide of that. And we keep going to the next one. And we designed some face coverings that allow people to see our lips. And we had these actually made in-house by one of our staff, but it was important to not be discriminating against any of our access patrons. We also had to drastically cut the facilities for our audiences in the building. So the toilets were stripped down, if we keep going, and the next one. Signage everywhere, and one of the things we've had to try and think about is all the signage we took down so that the signage that was relevant was visible to the people that needed to see it. We also had to slim down everything for our cafe and bar offering. So in the next couple of slides for that, please, including one-way systems around there. And we then started to give the longest briefings in the world to audiences on an individual basis. So the next slide for that, please, which involves a full clipboard, like almost an in-flight reception, really. This allowed us to actually be able to then start thinking about putting on the live shows on stage, which there's another slide of, where we're socially distancing everybody by 2 meters. I guess the thing that people may be interested in is how did we do this technically? So if we skip over the next slide briefly, which is just a 2 meter social distancing, we tried to use the DCMS guidance. This is very hard. This may be a controversial thing to say, but it is not an easy thing to do. It changes probably weekly, and the changes aren't necessarily advertised. And it's worth keeping an eye on this document, but it's very hard to use. We found documentation from the ABTT very helpful. So we've got a couple of quick slides of their 3 main documents, which are available online. The third one is very useful in terms of safe working procedures on stage, and we use that as well as the advice from, not the advice, sorry, the working document that Pirate Crew have been using, which was very, very useful to the industry. We also were listening to the costumers, so they've got a fantastic guide on their website. It looks like it's hidden behind a paywall, but it's not. They're just asking who you are, and so they can figure out who's looking at their information. This is really useful for close contact and cleaning of lots of things, especially soft surfaces. And then I collated everything into a 45-page working document that, for the first time in my life, a risk assessment went to my chief executive for his signature, and it also went to the board for their approval. So we've got a very boring slide of the front page of that, but the next page is the contents. I tried to think of everything. I know I definitely didn't. And we did at least 4 major revisions of this. If we keep going to the next one, we had personalised briefings for every member of the audience. We can't shout it out to the crew, to the queue out in the 2 meter socially distanced across the cafe or out the front of the building. And we can't let them cheer or shout or generally enjoy themselves audibly in the audience, which was one of the reasons for doing those briefings. We also did personalised briefings for every performer. If we go to the next slide. And again, that was quite an interesting conversation. We were talking about 30 acts all performing on stage, and you know, the first thing I want to say is hello Deptford, or you know, whatever their version of that is, and that they weren't able to encourage the audience in the way they normally perhaps would, which did leave some interesting moments. We used about 30 litres of a disinfectant. The next slide. I'm not advertising this particular one, but it's important to us that it said virucidal on it, and what we could find out what the active ingredients in it were. We'll skip over to the next one. And we get to the technical team, maybe what you're all interested in, but the bit that almost for us seemed a little bit easier because we have got a small production in-house team. And we had to socially distance all the time. This picture's from last Friday and took up 12 audience seats for the control positions instead of the normal none. For the festival itself, which was a few weeks previous, we took out 6 balcony bays for control, and that meant that we actually had to take over the whole balcony, which would take out 68 seats normally. In between each of these 30 shows, we cleaned everything. There was a new pair of gloves for every staff member for every performer station that they were cleaning. We changed every single vocal microphone's grill on stage so that it could be cleaned during the next performance thoroughly, and then it could be replaced for the next show after that. Every console had its own hand sanitizer next to it and its own dedicated operator. At the end of each day, the consoles were cleaned with isopropanol, very carefully, and wiped down. We're not flooding desks with fluids and causing ourselves other problems. Performers had dedicated access to stage left and technical staff were stage right. The social distancing on stage for a band was really quite difficult and took a lot of time to work out, and these were in 30-minute get in and sound checks before we turned into the next show. And that was so that we could put all of this on. It was worth all that effort, and the audiences coming into the shows and responding by largely banging their feet once we managed to persuade them not to cheer and shout was really rewarding and really important. So I think that's everything I had to say for the minute. So I look forward to questions as we get to them. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ben. Again, very interesting. A lot of process in there that seems pretty familiar to me. So that's encouraging. So I'm going to talk a little bit about a combination of things learned from a recent spate of small corporate events, some industrial theatre. The most significant project that I've done recently has been sort of 4 or 5 trucks worth of technical kit, a week's fit up and 1 day show, about just shy of 1,000 crew days to put in and take out, with a maximum of 120 people on site. So enough to get your teeth into, but not huge. Everything that I've done recently has been the model of management, the organizational structure has been the tried and tested and familiar production agency, bringing together a team of bespoke team of highly skilled freelance or self-employed people to meet the specific client's brief for that particular production. The key to success in all of these situations has been the right venue. We've needed a venue that we could design a layout inside to be COVID secure. Any existing built environment, permanent theatre, piece of architecture is going to have a huge range of challenges there, which we can eliminate almost entirely by picking a more flexible venue. So there are huge benefits to be had there. I have to say, across the board, the buy-in from the senior management, the commitment from them has been exemplary across the board. Everybody's wanted to do everything they possibly can to get their show on. So much so that actually significant amounts of time have been spent trying to rein them back in a way, in some cases, for having policies which were either of limited benefit or actually counterproductive in some cases. So it's important that that enthusiasm is turned to good effect, but can be a challenge to manage. So the process is very similar to what Ben's described. COVID-19 risk assessment as a first step. That helps to develop a COVID secure management plan for the space. That then generates further discipline-specific advice and guidance for the different departments. And again, the sources for that, very similar to the ones that Ben has identified, whether it be the ABTT or other specialist disciplines. And that's really important information from us. The vast majority of people working in production are not virologists. We need the general guidance that's produced by government and representative organisations to help us know what's reasonable. It's also interesting to note that in terms of the COVID bit itself, the standard risk assessment methodology, if you want to call it that, of having a likelihood and a consequence component of risk, the consequence is taken out of our hands because it's determined by the person's vulnerability, effectively. But there are some areas of the risk assessment where we can influence the consequence, particularly around the stress levels, mental health, and things like that. So that's been an interesting process to go through as well. A traditional matrix risk assessment isn't a very useful tool when you're doing a COVID-19 social distancing and hygiene risk assessment, but it's still very relevant for some of the other more detailed elements. So, as with all jobs, absolutely key that the cooperation and coordination with the client, the venue, and the production is robust. Everybody's talking to each other. That's not about the money; it's about the control. There's I've been on a number of seminars so far where responsibility keeps being tied into follow the money. But in this commissioning model, it's not all about the money. It's about who has control over what element of the job, and making sure that we coordinate and cooperate effectively across all of the different stakeholders. So that's our process for providing the information. To get it out to people, traditionally we always tend to do a site briefing when people turn up on site. That might be 3 or 4 minute site induction, which will cover the site-specific arrangements that everybody needs to know. We're not interested in covering manual handling because everyone should have been trained by their employer for that. We're not interested in covering work at height because everyone should have been selected based on their existing skill set. So it's the specific arrangements for that particular job in that particular venue on that particular day. Including COVID in that, over doubled the amount of time that induction takes. We decided not to do an on-site induction, so we produced it as a PowerPoint file that everybody had to download and watch before they came on site, and then a much shorter housekeeping thing when they actually turned up to get their badge. They had to acknowledge receipt and understanding and agree to what was set out in the briefing. In hindsight, the feedback from that was brilliant because everybody said that there was a really positive reaction. It gave people confidence. They understood how much had been put in place to help them stay safe. It gave them the confidence, reinforced how important it was, but made them want to help as well. So everybody was given the same information and everybody was prepared to engage with it and get on with it. We also used a self-declaration app that was provided by the client. Every day, everyone had to go onto the app and self-declare that they didn't, the series of answers to questions about symptoms or contact with other people. The client used that. They were effectively the tenant of the building, so that was one of the things that they put in place in terms of their responsibilities there. It was a corporate policy thing at the end of the day, but again, it was well received. We also did temperature checks, primarily down to corporate policy. It was a 2-step process, very clear that it wasn't a single thing, the only thing we were using to determine somebody's illness. One of a package of measures which we actually commissioned through the appointed medical provider, so that was all being done properly. We enhanced the hygiene facilities. So we used festival-style sinks. Everybody thought that was a fantastic idea to have them just before crew catering. So whether those people don't normally go and wash their hands before they go to crew catering or not, I don't know. But it was very well received. Hair and makeup as well, we positioned them specifically in the areas they were working. We had an enhanced cleaning program. So we actually ran tracks like stage management would for a show, as well as identifying defined areas which individual cleaners might be looking after. And a track might be maybe an hour and a half or 2-hour cycles, so someone might do all of the handrails around the entire building, and it would take them 2 hours to get around or an hour to get around, and then they'd be doing it again. So that was the enhanced cleaning. There were some discussions early on about the fog systems, mist systems overnight and all the rest of it, but there was nothing that we had that we couldn't clean with a cloth or a disinfectant. So we opted not to have the overnight things. They raised more questions than they answered. The space layout, the venue, Dominique's comment about needing 3 times the amount of space, I would absolutely concur with that. We were in a venue that was at least 3 times bigger than it needed to be, and we had enough space to do the job safely as a result. And again, it's a benefit that we see because we're booking the venue for the show. we're not constrained. We can choose the right venue for it. The only areas that didn't work was catering, and I'll come on to that. The layout was designed not only for social distancing, but also to keep the number of personal interactions down. So teams were, although socially distancing, they were lumped together in one area. So multiple sort of layers of control there. We made the crew identifiable by department, by colour, effectively. It could have been T-shirts, but we chose to use the tabard style, sort of pseudo high-vis things by department. And again, in hindsight, a lot of feedback. People thought it was fantastic that, whilst it wasn't a replacement for social distancing, it did make it very clear when somebody who wasn't in your department or your team had suddenly appeared in your midst, and just raised the awareness of that. And obviously, it goes without saying that anyone who needed to be out with the trucks or whatever else was in the yellow or orange and those other fantastic range of colours were reserved for people who were only going to be working in areas where the risk assessment didn't need them to wear high-vis. The schedule was fundamentally designed to avoid close working, but I'd have to say we do that anyway. And the separation in time and space, we do that anyway. The riggers went in early before anyone was bringing the rest of the kit in. We didn't have to change very much in that sense at all. Catering, as I say, we had unforeseen challenges with that. 120 crew and a catering area, which with social distancing would only accommodate 56. So we had shifts, maximum of 2 people at a table. And the effect on site in the reality of that was that it was a profoundly negative experience. So it was changed, 3 people per table, 6 foot round. So we could just about do that with 2 meters still between people. And that had a really huge benefit to the vibe on site. Really, really important change that was made to what had been planned. Self-regulation was the method of policing all of this, if you like. We didn't opt for COVID monitors or people with specific responsibility to check if people were doing their social distancing or not. Everyone bought into it. Everybody had the authority to challenge anybody else. There was a fantastic comment from somebody on the theatre, the entertainment stage group, not the medical expert stage group, that they have a code word of lurgy, and that's all you need to say in a team is if you're unhappy about how close somebody's got, then you say lurgy, and that is a fantastic way of diffusing something that could be quite a difficult issue to do. Senior leadership buy-in and always available to resolve any issues, which was a critical thing for us. It's very easy on a job like that because we're all on site together. The other thing about the COVID monitors, I know the film and TV industry have parts of that are using them to great effect, I'm sure. But they only work when the monitor's there. And the other side to it, which concerns me, is that as soon as you make it somebody else's problem, then it is that somebody else's problem, and everybody forgets to take responsibility themselves. So just to wrap up on that bit from my side, there was some mention earlier on about testing. We did provide some testing, but it was only in terms of commercial risk to make the production more resilient. It wasn't done as a preemptive, and we didn't have any close contact cohorts to worry about in that sense. But in terms of commercial resilience, the ability to carry out tests without having to go through the official public available test process was a really, really important factor, so that we could determine the result of somebody's symptoms very quickly and make a decision based on a very quick decision as to what option of plan B or plan C needs to be put in place. So as a quick summary, talking to various people, overall, we reckon in the production sense, there was a 20% uplift in cost over what people would have normally expected for the type of event. Some elements were really not affected very much, but others were fundamentally different. And COVID-19 planning needs to be integrated right from the very, very beginning of a project in that sense. And I will just touch on the on transport as well. Somebody's already asked a question in advance on this, and how do we socially distance if we're loading a show in? With a corporate event like the ones I'm describing, we can influence that on the drawing board, and by the way we specify the service provisions. So the lighting and technical trucks were not stacked floor to ceiling, as you might normally expect. So the everything could be got out of the truck an awful lot easier. Some equipment stayed on its wheels and it was just restrained by load bars. The set curtain siders, a drawbar combination, which actually gives you more space than a traditional Arctic, but means that you can unload with a forklift, even in quite a small space. So in terms of the scenic element, it's very easy to, if that's how you know you're going to need to do it on site, then everything is designed and fabricated to suit that that mode. So there's an awful lot we can do, and one could have, there is an argument that says we should be doing some of that as a more routine approach anyway, really. So I haven't yet had a gig where the steel deck needs to be carried up the fire escape, but in other sense, everything was fairly straightforward, and maybe those days have gone, which would be a benefit, a good outcome from this. So that's my sort of very brief overview of my experience in the corporate industrial theatre world from recent times. I'm going to give a very quick summary of the DCMS working group position at the moment as well. Phil Brown from SALT UK Theatre very kindly updated me last week. He sits in all the working groups. So I'll run through that very quickly and then we'll hear from Carl. So people are probably aware there are 4 working groups that are liaising with the DCMS. And there are reps from all sorts of live events. It's not just theatre, it's not just touring, it's not just music, it's all live events that are represented in there. The 4 working groups, the first one is working with audiences, and the key area they're looking at the moment is how social distancing is being interpreted and measured. What are the ends of the distance that we're talking about? 2 meters, what are we measuring the 2 meters between? And how is the interpretation? And I think Carl might have some words for us on this in terms of the 1 meter plus and those other things. The next working group is managing infrastructure. So that's your buildings and the facilities inside. The key area of discussion at the moment there is ventilation, and the decision or discussion around whether a risk management approach, rather than a prescriptive set of requirements, that discussion is ongoing, and obviously it has a huge impact for venues that have an existing system that might not meet a prescribed set of requirements or whatever else. So they're looking at that. There's a lot of discussion and just trying to decide what metrics are most useful in terms of the ventilation, but that's the big topic there. Supporting the workforce, all of our fantastic crew, staff, technicians, etc., front of house staff. The key areas being discussed there are the relaxation of social distancing, work being done on contact time, so maximum duration before contact is deemed to have been close. Questions about how useful testing might be or not as well are being discussed there. Touring is the 4th category of the 4th working group, and the key things there are there's quite a range of them, and it really shows up the diversity of our industry. Huge challenges with social distancing, trying to tour an existing show that wasn't designed with any consideration, and Dominique's mentioned there that an existing show is a difficult thing. It needs to be simplified in many cases. Insurance is a big topic at the moment for touring, obviously with going through different regions where they might have different status, and digs, issues around self-isolating on a theatre tour where you're using digs or whatever else. And the last one then is exemptions for self-isolation requirements for overseas acts, which would be similar to the sort of system that the competitive sport world are using at the moment to move athletes around. Those discussions are ongoing. So I've paraphrased what Phil was kind enough to go through with me. Please don't take any of that too literally, but it gives us a flavour of where the discussions are going to help influence how the DCMS put further guidance or support or whatever else in place our way. So that's it from me for the moment. We're going to hear from Carl now, and after Carl's enlightened us with a few bits and pieces, then we'll go into some question and answer stuff. So Carl, over to you.
Okay, thank you, Tom. Like always, the regulator follows and has his thunder stolen by the people who speak much better than he does. But no, everything which has been said beforehand, we would, of course, endorse. And Ben, major revisions to risk assessments are always well thought of when we hear that word as a regulator. We like risk assessments being reviewed often. So like that was good to put in. And Tom and Dominique mentioning about social distancing. The guidance is 2 meters, and it stays at 2 meters. There is no confusion in a regulator's mind, and there's no confusion when either ourselves or local authority will visit that how you're managing the 2 meter social distancing guidelines, and where things can't be done at 2 meters, 1 meter isn't good enough. It's always a consideration. It's 1 meter plus measures, and it is what the measures are which then become very, very important, very interesting. And I would imagine that in an events, live events situation where space is an issue, the actual thought at the risk assessments and the planning procedures, processes of what can those measures be? Are they masks? Are they physical measures? Are you able to segregate until a very last moment in different areas, port cabins, car parks, depending on size of events? Those sorts of things are what a regulator, when they visit, would like to hear, would like to see consideration of. And where they aren't going to work, it's important that people know why, because that could be a question which is asked. A regulator will go into a variety of places and will see a variety of different resolutions on how to manage social distancing. And what we would think as normal from seeing other industries won't work, we need to know why it won't work. And you haven't just jumped at the easiest, cheapest, less secure route just because. So you need that to be in place and well thought of in the risk assessment process. Mentioned earlier cooperation, and that's important from all parties, and it's cooperation over tasks, over the timing and the scheduling of tasks, cooperation between the different trades, the hairdressers, the makeup artists, the artists themselves, the road crew. All of those things need to have good cooperation, as normally they would have. But it's more important now because good cooperation can help maintain good social distancing. And of course, the managers should have a good, watchful, monitoring eye upon that, because people want the job to be done, and it is very easy to fall into the, well, I'll just do this mode and do something which under normal circumstances may be safe, not quite correct, but safe. But in the new world that we currently live in, where social distancing is necessary, it may be putting people at enhanced risk. So you need to monitor how things are being worked. Other than that, really, there's not a lot for me to say, other than the way are controlled in a legal format is with 2 real areas which can be demarcated and are legally demarcated. At one point, you've got the workplace and the arrangements for the employers, the employees, and the public, arrangements on how you are going to manage and keep the public safe. That falls as normal under the health and safety at work regulations and everything that the regulations which fall under those. The other aspect, though, is of course how members of the public will behave or be managed to behave when they are actually at the event and the event is live. At that point, a different set of regulations out with HSE. Oh, sorry about that. It was turned off. Typical. And the HSE would not have any powers there because as a team and as a workplace, you have managed to put in measures which are suitable and sufficient. You've socially distanced the audience. You've socially distanced the cast. You've managed to enact how people will enter and leave the venue in a safe manner. All of those things would fall within the Health and Safety at Work Act. Once the audience is in, and if they're then not maintaining social distancing, that's a public health issue, and that is where public health can have the business and the responsibilities at that time to enforce or to actually manage under a legal situation. It is a public health issue. It does not become a workplace issue. And I think it's important that people realise that there are those two different routes where an event may fall foul of enforcement, because it's very easy if you take a live event, put it into a fairground environment where it's much more loosely managed, as it were. The crowd come in through the fence. How that crowd behaves once they're within the fairground fencing area, it's outside the control in the main of the holder there. He's put everything involved that needs to be there. Oh, for God's sake. He's put everything there that needs to be, and it's down to a public issue now not following his safe arrangements. Sorry about the phone call. Hopefully I've explained that in a manner. If there's any questions on that, I shall certainly try and answer them. Other than that, back to you, Tom.
Lovely. Thank you very much, Carl. Again, very interesting and great to get that clarity on the difference between the workplace and the public health side of things. So we've got about 10 or 15 minutes left to take some questions. There's a few that have been sent in advance, which I'm hoping we've probably covered off a little bit already. And I'm just having a look at the chat now to see what else has come in. Right. So let's kick off with socially distancing while loading in a show. I touched on that, but Ben, have you got any experience of what you've had to do differently there?
We've just taken a lot more time and broken the tasks down, basically, and it's more expensive in lots of different ways, more expensive, but it's the only way to do it, really. It's where there's been a lot of conversation on lots of the different groups trying to work out how to come up with guidance on it, but it's just more resources, mainly in terms of time, I think. Fair
enough. Dominique, have you done anything differently in terms of your loading?
No, we simplified smaller stuff, but at the opera, we're quite lucky in our building. We've got hoist and crane, and we're very, most of the thing is on caster wheels, or we use the cranes. So we don't do many group lifting. Most of the group lifting we used to have were like a table for props, the table that need to put on stage. Then that we just simply don't do it anymore.
Fair enough. Very good. Okay. Venue capacity guidelines and whether they can be explained is another question that we had up front. I think, paraphrasing what Carl said, really, the distancing is key. It's not the capacity is determined by how the social distancing is implemented. The DCMS working groups are looking at that at the moment and trying to come up with some more useful metrics for us. So I'm not sure any of us can answer that specifically at the moment in terms of an explanation of the capacity guidelines, but it is just down to the social distancing element.
Yeah, there's a proposal gone to DCMS from the industry, and that's currently under consideration, and it's my understanding, Tom, and we're all waiting to hear what that is so it can be clarified. But
and it is absolutely key, isn't it? To be able to plan something, we have to know what the constraints are going to be. So
yeah,
fair enough. Okay, the outdoor side of things. Ben, you started off outdoors early on. Did you have any particular challenges there?
I think, well, Yes, in that outdoors doesn't necessarily make it simple, in that it still has to be contained and controllable, and there isn't an instant festival site. We're quite lucky here, we've got a garden and we can put things inside it, but the access is still fixed, the toilets are still necessary, all the other bits of production are still necessary. So whilst it was easier in terms of the guidance and legislation that we could restart outdoor performance quite quickly, actually we had to put just as much thought into it that we'd put into anything else, and the space was still king, I suppose, and that we had to still present things that would work with an audience that was still 2 meters socially distant between bubbles or households.
Fair enough, and it adds the other dynamic of obviously needing to protect the equipment and make sure that there's good weather cover and all the bits and pieces that go with that, so it becomes a proper outdoor event that needs a wind action management plan and all those kind of elements as well. But that's well serviced already within our industry. We have people who are very capable of managing all of that. So Dominique, from Ken here about your testing strategy. Who, how often, how reliable?
Testing is pretty complex because new tests come in the market on the weekly basis. I mean, it's just flooded the markets with a lot of labs proposing their brand new tests that are all fantastic according to their advertising. First, we kind of looked at NHS guidance on testing. That's like the Dcms guidance. It changed very quickly and very often. So keeping with the knowledge is really difficult. Until last week, and this is changing now, we were doing antibodies once a month. And if someone was positive from antibodies, that means that they had the immunity, but then we didn't test them anymore. If they were negative for antibodies, which is most of our people that we tested were negative for antibodies, then we do an antigen test, which was twice a week. And so people keep being tested, and it's negative test means that they didn't have any signs of COVID. Positive test means that they had to go home and leave the building. And if they had a positive test and they were working in a bubble, we look at some like couples dancing, then the person they're dancing with was also going home. So it was quite a high risk with a bubbling of dancers, especially in dancers' lab. Many of them live with each other, flat sharing, but also the partners is also part of the same company. So if A and B dance together in a bubble, A live with C and B live with D. And so if A get tested and positive, when you lose B and you lose C. So it was really, really difficult, and it was quite a high risk because at any point we could lose our top dancers, and people that work in the bubbles are soloists and the top dancers are principals. So it was quite high risk. So the big important, I think, message with testing is you don't drop your guard. It's not because you get tested that you drop your guard. For example, the classes in the morning, ballet dancers start 9:30, 10 o'clock with classes. Then every studio was measured, every bar in the studio was measured, and everybody has an allocated space. And we had to have a cleaning situation and rotations where usually they take the classes all together. You could have more than 15 at that point. With 77 dancers, it's a really, in terms of logistics, it's a real challenge. And the corps du ballet just stayed apart. They just never danced together. Only the soloists and the principals that were in bubbles that danced together, and they all danced with mask on at all the time, except of course the performance night, and once they had their makeup and hair done. But up to that point, mask on all the time. So it's challenging and it's demanding, and there's always that necessity to remind them of a rule, because it's like, oh, I get tested and it's fine, and they can relax, but constantly needs to remind them, like, it's not because you get tested but you can huddle together 6 in the lift. Things like this, simple things like this. So yeah, it can't be done single-handed. It needs to be done as part of the package, I will say. Anything else?
Lovely. Thank you, Dominique. That's great. Ben, one's coming from you. Did you have any issues with compliance, either from performers, staff, or audience?
That's a good one. So the performers were unbelievably excited to be able to perform, and one of them very specifically said, I will do absolutely anything you need me to do. If I need to be in a full hazmat suit just because I can be on a stage and see some audience, I am prepared to perform like that. I think the biggest compliance issue was audience response. So we ended up having to build a slide and flash it on all the projection surfaces that said, please don't cheer, coronavirus is rubbish, these guys are great, stamp your feet, clap your hands, but you can't be cheering and shouting, or some words like that. And that, music gigs in particular, there is a culture of having an alcoholic drink before or after, and you want to enjoy yourself. And how we temper that culture change was a challenge. I mean, we're very lucky. The ventilation into the theatres very good, and we can do 100% fresh supply, and it gets exchanged 6 times an hour, which is on the good side of things. We have looked at some other things. So someone mentioned something about UVC. We're looking into it, but it's incredibly complicated, is the only thing that I currently understand for an efficient system that will do what we want it to do. But yeah, the audience are probably the biggest challenge.
Lovely, thank you, Ben. We've got a question around costs, inevitably. As I mentioned, in my industrial theatre experience, we reckon there's a 20% uplift on production costs, but that's on a one-off job. In terms of running costs for an establishment, how are they affected, and what the how does it stack up against the revenue?
At the opera, the running costs of a COVID safe, it's massive. If you look at testing, for the number of people we test, is roughly £10,000 per week. That's just a single running cost. But we were lucky where, one, we have sponsor, and two, the marketing worked wonderfully well, and we sold so far 16,000 tickets at £16 each. So that has worked out for us, but the running costs are absolutely astronomical, I will say. And it's not only the running cost, it's the fact that you're also losing money by not being able to put over production because you're using that space. And it's a hidden cost, I will say.
So maybe jumping in on that, but we're both in the subsidised sector, Dominique and myself, and the budgets are in the bin. The budgets have been rewritten 100 times since April the 1st, and will be written another 100 times, despite positive announcements for us yesterday on Cultural Recovery Fund. I suppose for us, the running costs are probably about the same as they ever were, but the income, certainly from ticket sales, is basically negligible because the capacity is basically negligible. But there is a cultural imperative to continue to offer art to everybody.
Yeah.
Rock and roll world, maybe that's a slightly different thing, but there are solutions. It's just looking at the whole budget from beginning to end, I guess, is the only bit of shining light I can say. The other thing is there was some really good news in the Cultural Recovery Fund announcements yesterday for production companies, audio companies. So there is some light in there, even though it is a pretty dark time.
Yeah, and I think Fund is the same. Our room is capacity is 2,200 seats. And with public, on Friday, we had 400 plus guests. And among them, we had the Secretary of State for Dcms, Royal Family also. Just no pressure there with our guests. And it's so from 2,200, we'll get roughly, with the stall seats back on 40% capacity. Our business model post-COVID was we need 96% occupancy to balance the sheet. And from 96%, we fall now to 40%. capacity. So no way we will be able to make that viable. But like Ben, the art must go on. It must go on. We can't drop it, and we are lucky to have donors. And unfortunately, we're also making people redundant. We're losing a lot of staff to bring down our production cost.
Okay, thank you very much. We've got to 3 o'clock. We've all survived, hopefully. There is one very quick question I can answer from Steve. A question for Tom: what were your concerns regarding fogging? Didn't have any specific concerns. It just didn't do something that we needed to do. We could manage the cleaning by other means. And when it was being considered, there were a lot of questions that we would have needed to answer had we chosen to go that route, which we then didn't need to answer because we decided we could manage in other ways. So that was the one on the fogging. Carl, have you got anything else that you would like to add at this juncture before we wrap up?
No, I've got nothing to add at all. Thank you for inviting me.
No problem at all. Okay, so it just remains for me to express my gratitude to Plaza for organising these seminars, members of the panel who've provided such interesting and useful insights into their work, those of you that have asked questions, even the difficult ones, and everyone who's logged on in the hope that something interesting or relevant might come up. Hopefully it has. So yeah, we hope it's been useful to you, and thank you very much for attending. Goodbye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.